Thank you, Mary Jose. So I'm very happy to talk about the land use portion of the Land Cover 6K project a little bit. So Marie Jose showed this sort of overview of the Land Cover 6K strategy of using land covered land use data to help inform LCC models, and I'm primarily talking about this section of it, the archaeology-based land use data. So it's worth mentioning, of course, why we're mapping land use and land cover independently, because they are related, and we're interested in what those relationships are, not just documenting one or the other. That the anthropogenic land cover change models are building in understandings of human landscape relationships, and it's important to be teasing those relationships apart as part of the process of kind of improving our understanding of them into the past and how they can help make these land cover change models more accurate. Marie-José already talked about this a little bit, the sort of limits of the known limits of current anthropogenic land cover change models. She showed this slide. Can't really see. Okay, so we know these are published for based primarily on population data going into the past for the Holocene, and they make significant assumptions about relationships between populations in the past and what land use was like, and this results in pretty poor agreement between models, as she was already showing. I also like to point out sort of the limitations of the scale of anthropogenic land cover change models, that they are based on national boundaries, which is useful and convenient for tracking modern land use and tying population data across global boundaries, but becomes problematic when this is modeled backwards into the past, because those boundaries continue to appear in the past. So I have this little visualization of the HIDE data running backwards through time. So it's the time scale is down here, and the boundary between Egypt, the border between Egypt and Israel, persists as cropland back several thousand years, which it definitely did not, right? So we want to be able to apply more direct evidence for how land use was changing in the past by getting some archaeological data to bear, bringing some archaeological data to bear on this. So this is something that should be possible. We have decades of archaeological data that provides information about land use in a variety of different ways, but archaeological data is rarely synthesized at a global level. It's generally very region and time specific. We get wildly varying terminology across regions and through time periods, and highly varied levels of research and interest in research and density of research across different regions. So the land use section of Land Cover 6K is really saying how can archaeology help contribute to this better understanding of human use into the past. So the land use section is really trying to do a synthesis of archaeological and historical data to build categorical assessments based on multiple criteria, using expert judgment and published archaeological data in this iterative data structure to build a global database. Like the land cover side of the project that Marie-José was talking about, we have this broken up into regional coordinating groups that's working section by section to build this global database. And really critically, we're trying to build this at a very high resolution to take advantage of, at least in many of the places in the world where we get very, very densely published archaeological data. So the grid of data being produced is 8 by 8 kilometer squares. So we get something like 2.5 million grid squares covering the globe. And this will create land use maps in a database that can be both used by archaeologists as a way of synthesizing data and potentially making interesting observations about how archaeological data is informing regional differences, and then also primarily to help improve ALCC models. So this is a challenge. There's no universal language for classifying land use and talking about how the archaeology maps on to land use. Land use systems are, of course, typically mosaic, so we get different kinds of land use closely packed together at various points in time. We shouldn't expect simple unilinear trajectories of change that we can see. Here is where everything changes from hunting, gathering, foraging, fishing to agriculture, and it never goes back or never changes. There's no gray area here. We have complex relationships between land use, population change, and climate that are also not unidirectional. And our evidence for past land use is highly variable. It's really incredible to see sort of the differences in density of published archaeological data, both within time periods and between regions. So one of the major outcomes from the land use section recently is the publication of our land use classification system. This was just published this year in PLOS One, and is sort of the structure for how to create a global database of land use based on published archaeological data. And this was built in consultation with all the stakeholders on the project. So archaeologists working in different regions, climate modelers, the people building anthropogenic land cover change models, the land cover folks, to get something that is hierarchical, scalable, can be applied across all the different regions that we want to be able to be tracking this data. And as Maria also talked about, we're doing this at only a few key time slices through the Holocene. So the main time slices that this is being built at are 12,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and 1500 CE. This is as requested by the modelers, and in coordination with land cover folks. And then the regional groups working semi-independently are also able to select additional time slices where there might be critical transitions or local interests where their data supports having a more fine-grained tracking of temporal changes. And so, as I said, the sort of regional variability and temporal differences in published archaeological data sets is really fairly dramatic. We're trying to incorporate archaeological data and historical data, and those can be of very different scales of information. And then regionally, you get really dense quantities of published sites and dates and specialist analyses that help inform this. So archaeological and archaeobotanical analyses in places like Europe, and then in other regions of the world, there will be much less of that data. So fewer sites published, fewer specialized data sets to go along with them, fewer total dates. And so we get really large differences in the abundance of sites and data, both between regions and time periods. And so this requires to produce the single database in the classification structure, judgment-based syntheses by the regional study groups, and also variable methods for how to connect the existing data to that published database structure. And so the different groups are working this problem out for how it makes sense for the availability of data for their regions. So we had a case study in the PLOS One paper that just came out showing what this looks like in the database structure as it exists for classification. So we have this is the case study for the Middle East at 6,000 years ago, using these 8 by 8 kilometer grid cell sizes. And so at 6K in the Middle East, we can track quite a large number of different dominant land use types across the region. So in the large part of the interior of Arabia, it's classified as extensive minimal, so people are present, but they're not living permanently on the landscape, except in a few places along the coast. Here, we have primarily hunter-gatherer fishing and foraging. And then in the Fertile Crescent, we can see both rain-fed and with water modification agriculture. And so we get really kind of fine-grained level of detail about what's going on here. And this compares nicely to sort of one of the strengths, but also one of the difficulties of this approach is this fine-grained resolution, which archaeologists are really interested in. If you're looking at the area where an individual archaeologist works, they have lots of ideas about the level of detail that's possible for the areas that they know something about. So this really gives us a lot of detail, and it compares with similar projects like Archaeoglobe that are also producing land use data at a global scale using a very different methodology of building consensus data from experts. But the resolution of that data is quite different with much, much larger polygons to cover the same region. So only a few polygons, giving a much less detailed idea of how land use is varying within each of the time slices. So we have, as we said, regional groups working independently on the different regions of the world, trying to connect the existing data sets, existing archaeological data to this classification structure. And those projects are all actively ongoing, connecting this data and trying to produce it and get it published, which is a significant challenge. In terms of the current work, we have we have the land use classification structure published, and then all of the groups are in process for each region. We're nearing publication for time slices in the Middle East sections, in China, in Europe, in South Asia, and just beginning to try and work on the integration between regions so we can connect these disparate groups together and try to begin to make continuous data sets that'll make really the primary goal of the project. And then I'll talk a little bit about one more additional thing that we're working on also as it relates to anthropogenic land cover change models, and that's improving understandings of per capita land use. So this is something that I've been working on a lot recently. Of course, per capita land use, this is the amount of land necessary per person in a region. And the anthropogenic land cover change models rely on PCLU estimates to reconstruct land cover change, but because there's limited availability of information about how per capita land use varies through time and space, ALCC models assume very few differences in per capita land use within the same land use category. So for instance, at least in the past, Hive used a single per capita land use number for agriculture for all periods in the past. And so it's entirely, the differences are entirely being driven by population estimates. But we know that per capita land use does in fact vary quite significantly within the same kind of land use type and between regions and through time. And so it's difficult to reconstruct historical PCLU values at a global scale and understand how they should change in the past. So one of the additional projects that the land use side of the LC6K project has been working on is a new historical database of per capita land use, trying to pull together all of the data that we can grab that lets us get more nuance about per capita land use. So we're building this from a variety of sources. We have modern data since 1960 from the FAO, and this is primarily what the LCC models use now. But then also building from archaeological sources, ethnographic sources, and of published PCLU information, or from which PCLU information can be derived, and then calculating historical values, also pulling in data from other projects based on archaeological and climatic data, like the Rhine LULCC data. So we have in this new database something like 1,800 PCLU values, and this is a map showing the distribution of them. We get a reasonably nice coverage across the globe, and a reasonable pattern through time. And in this database, we get sort of the expected pattern reflecting significant differences between the major land use types tracked in the land use database. So as we should expect, agriculture, this is in terms of hectares per person, that agriculture has the smallest land use per capita versus pastoralism, which generally uses more, requires more space, and then hunter-gatherer fishing, foraging, that requires the most space, but sort of remarkably has such a really broad range of PCLU requirements depending on a wide variety of things, including long-term modification and management of ecosystems and climate, local resources. So this database is really letting us track changes both across regions, within regions, and through time. So for instance, we can track, if we have enough historical data for each region where we have PCLU values, we can see how within the same land use type, so this is all agriculture data through time for China, PCLU values per capita land use goes down dramatically very recently, but all the way through time from 2,000 years ago. And we can also plot PCLU just against climate data and see that it, as you would expect, varies depending on location, not just on land use type. So really, this is helping to give us increased nuance for the major land categories of land use, give more fine-grained variation within these categories to track things like differences in how wild resource management in hunting, gathering, fishing, foraging societies affects land use, and the effects of changing agricultural technologies and shifts in, or the presence of, surplus production really affecting how much, how land is used even within the same food production strategy. So this PCLU database is capturing some of that variation, giving us ways to track differences among land use categories, and hopefully can help inform ALCC models by giving more of this nuance. So thank you for listening. Sort of an overview of the land use work that we're doing as part of LandCover6k, that this work is really building new research networks, connecting all this untapped archaeological data, I think, in ways that are really interesting for it to be used. That it's fascinating as an archaeologist to be able to see how we can connect this data to anthropogenic land cover change data, and the building new tools for collaboration, putting together this land use database and this PCLU database to help create these data sets that can be used both within archaeology and for wider collaborations. So I think that I have talked for long enough. Thank you very much.